Hello, everyone, and welcome to our episode of Ask the Marxist Anything. We've done a few now, not with Marxism, but we had last week had Dennis Alexander, where we asked the biologist anything, and man, did we ask him anything and everything. I think he's still struggling to recover from that. Before that, we had Stanley Havervas. And next week we've got somebody else, but today we've got Jonty Langley to chat to us about Marxism. I'm going to ask him a couple of questions before we chat about who Jonty, what we're going to do, and about Marxism. Let me just say one or two things about Jonty. So, I think Jonty, your biggest claim to fame is the fact that you are pretty good friends. I don't want to use the word best. I don't want to use the B word, but you're pretty good friends with my wife, which is. Which is problematic. You feature way too often in our family conversations, I'm afraid.
I'd want it no other way, obviously, but that's awesome to hear. Your wife is one of the most spectacular human beings I've ever met, and
that does not mean I'm going to go easy on you on this debate.
So I just try to soften you up, man. I thought. I also wanted to say I was a bit worried. I was like, this is a church thing, moes ek 'n das gedraai het, maar I think I'm okay. I think we're all good.
Well, I mean, the dust is one thing. The skulls on your wall is way more problematic than any type of
skull. Every time I do something for work, I have to take them down because I do a fair amount of kind of like video broadcasting for work, and because I work for a mission agency. Obviously, some people may.
I was going to say that when I introduced you. So you.
Oh, damn it! I'm stealing the thunder. I'll shut up.
So Jonty Langley, he's best friends with my wife. He's got weird taste in art, apparently. He's from Pretoria. He studied at, not studied, you went to Pretoria Boys High School. That's where that posh, annoying accent comes from. And then went to the University of Pretoria, studied philosophy. Am I right? Honors degree, philosophy?
Honors degree, and I dropped out of my master's course at the point of where I was doing final edits on my dissertation. Because I had moved to another country and I got commitment issues and I'm lazy. So
there we go. Didn't you do your honors degree, your dissertation on Marx?
I did it on more generally why I thought that Christians should be more aligned with leftist politics than right-wing politics. Which at the time I thought was a total revelation, and I was the first person to come to that. This classic kind of honors philosophy student. I was like, guys, I'm going to blow your minds. That's what I did that on. And then my master's was on postmodern concepts of truth and how that would affect absolutist religions like Christianity, particularly through modernist structures like concepts of human rights and that sort of stuff. So probably a lot of what more right-wing Christianity is concerned with now.
Yes, you were so postmodern in your master's that you didn't even finish it. Like that is
I finished it, like Derrida would say.
Oh, okay. Any case, the point is, you work for a missions agency in the UK.
Yeah,
and it's pretty cool work that you do there. You're a writer, freelancing. You've got a very interesting podcast that I can recommend to the people called Beer Christianity. I've got a book here somewhere, Mere Christianity. He's got a podcast called Beer Christianity with the catchphrase, slogan, what do you call it, subtitle, Faith, Hops, and Love. Okay, Beer Christianity, Faith, Hops, and Love. And I think that podcast title will tell you all you need to know about Jonty. Jonty, obviously I hear my wife talk about you all the time, but I read some cool articles that you've written for the Huffington Post. There was one on Zizek that was really, really cool, that I can also recommend. Maybe, I know it's going to sound like you're blowing your own horn, but I will not be angry with you if you post a link to that article on this Zoom. As a matter of fact, I'm asking you to do it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and with that introduction, I'm gonna stop now, Jonty, because people came here for a fight, not for.
That's right. I love it.
Yeah. So in terms of the format, the two of us are going to have a bit of a conversation, the back and forth, and then we can get some people from YouTube and the other guys who are joining us on Zoom can also pop in. I just noticed the previous time it was a little bit all over the place because we allowed questions to come in, so we struggled a little bit with structure, which is fine. But maybe just for the first bit, until we've put something on the table, we can wait before we open it up for Q&A. And Jonty's just posted that thing. I can really recommend it. That's Huffington Post. What is the title of that thing?
Leftist supergroup, one night only, Assange, Zizek, and Varoufakis on stage. It just felt like a rock concert to me when I saw them.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So Jonty, the first thing that you must help me figure out is we had a little flyer with Marx's face in the front and red in the back. We also had one with your face in the front, and I'm not sure what color at the back. And we just said, ask the Marxist anything. And I immediately got a response. And it's interesting because we had a guy here who's a theistic evolutionist, which a lot of Christians would be worried about. We had a guy who, half of us can be considered quite postmodern in some circles, which can also be considered heretical. But it's interesting that the thing that gets people boiling is the Marxist. Now, having said that, I don't think it's just free market people who has a monopoly on getting angry about this. My Marxist friends here get so emotional when we're having a conversation about economic theory. So why is it that we struggle to have a mature conversation about economic theories?
I think because they're so close to our hearts, like where your treasure is, your heart is also, and our hearts are with our treasure. And I think any kind of economic theory that talks about or threatens redistribution, distributive justice generally, I think that's going to make people feel a little bit nervous. And I think getting upset about Marxism, I think a lot of it comes down to propaganda, Cold War propaganda. I remember going to felt school and being told that pornography was all produced by the Soviet Union, as were all hard drugs to bring down Western society and make us immoral, which is weirdly close to North Korean rhetoric and their own kind of propaganda about the West. So I think there's a propaganda war that has been won against Marxism in the West. We get taught a very specific narrative in school, and I think it comes down to we're a little bit afraid of that word. In America, you say socialism and it terrifies people. In Britain, you say socialism and they have the national health, and generally speaking, they're not that frightened of it. I think the reason people get emotional about it on both sides is because economics are really important. I think economic justice is really important. I think if you take the Bible seriously and you read it a lot, it just comes up all the time. So
let's start from there. You mentioned the Bible, so I guess you would consider yourself a Christian before you consider yourself a Marxist. So I'm curious, what is it about your faith that makes you go left politically?
Yeah, I think it's a few things, but if we're talking about the economic side of it, I'm a Baptist, so I believe in personal freedom. We're the real Protestants, so we do believe in a personal relationship with God and our own personal conscience, and I know that comes into tension with what I'm going to say later. I think the reason why I care about it is because of God's attitude to the poor. The whole way through the Bible, there is this strong, and I'm not saying it's everything in it. I think there are different themes and streams that happen in the Bible, and some people talk about it as different voices, and I don't want to sound like a relativist or a kind of hardcore pluralist or anything like that, but there is this stream in the Bible of economic justice from the prophets, and even in the law, I think. I'm not a biblical scholar by any means. And right through to Jesus, and right through to the epistles as well, and the Gospels. They're just, God cares about the poor because he cares about humanity. And I think it's really hard. It was really hard for me to understand that as somebody growing up in Waterkloof in Pretoria. As much as my parents were poorer than the other people on the street, as much as they were left-wing ANC supporters, all of that sort of stuff, as much as they were hippies, basically, we still lived a life of privilege. I still live a life of privilege. I'm living in the UK. I'm part of the middle class. I'm a white-collar worker. But the more seriously I took my faith, the more I realized there is something wrong with the way the world is currently. There is poverty that my old boss, the head of this mission agency, said, poverty is not man-made. No, poverty is not natural. Poverty is man-made, and it's a stench in the nostrils of God. And I think I feel that. And I think looking around for why is it like this? Is there any connection between all of this human suffering, particularly for those who lack wealth and therefore lack power? And And a lot of Marx's analysis, not all of it, but a lot of Marx's analysis made a lot of sense to me. So cards on the table. I'm not a Marxist theorist by any means, but I am very warm towards Marxist analysis and particularly towards socialism. And I completely understand why people would support communism, with the obvious caveats around faith and that sort of thing. So for me, it's because Jesus cares about every single human being. We are made in the image of God, and he doesn't want us to suffer needlessly. And yes, we will have poor with us always. And yes, suffering is part of the lot of man. But I think some of it is unnecessary. If I walk up to you and I punch you in the face, you don't get to go, oh, well, suffering is a lot of man. You're going to ascribe some agency to me. I don't think you need to be a conspiracy theorist to feel like there may be systemic problems. If you have an economic system that is based on rational self-interest or greed, it's unlikely that it's going to bear, I don't want to over-spiritualize, but to me, if the root is greed, it's unlikely that its fruit will be pure. If the root is justice, then I think that's different. So when I spoke to a Nepali Christian, right? I was interviewing him for my job. The Nepali Christians had been oppressed for a really long time by Hindu fundamentalists in the Kingdom of Nepal before it kind of opened up. There was a civil war between the government, mostly kind of Hindu, not necessarily fundamentalist, but Hindu monarchist forces, and Maoist rebels who had a reputation for being brutal and vicious and take no prisoners, kind of literally. Interestingly, now in a power-sharing government in Nepal, I think. But at the time, I was asking him, well, it's really tough because you're getting pressed on both sides. The government doesn't trust you because you're Christians. The Marxists don't trust you because you're Christians. This must be really difficult. And his response was, yeah, but we have a lot more in common with the Maoists because they care about the poor like we do. I spoke to another guy who was a kind of academic dean at an international seminary in Prague, who came from, I don't know, one of the former Soviet states. He said he started off as a young communist and then became a Southern Baptist after he became a Christian. And I was like, oh, that's a big jump. And he was like, is it though? And he said to me, the reason why you have communism is because the church is... Indeed. He said to me, the reason why you have communism is because the church has failed to do its job of making justice real and bringing the kingdom in the world. And I think that's true.
Yeah, I can agree with that. But I wouldn't go to communism because I would agree with that position. One thing that let me just take a step back. So you say that in Nepal, it was interesting to see that he was a Christian who got excited. Well, he didn't get excited, but he sided more with Marxism, with the Maoists than with the Hindus.
Yeah, he wasn't a Marxist at all, but he liked what they did. It's kind of that Spurgeon quote of like, I like their way of doing it more than your way of not doing it.
Oh, that's cute. But something, and this is where you need to figure out where do you differentiate yourself from classical Marxism or communism or whatever. It gets a little bit confusing after a while, but we did advertise this thing as Ask the Marxist Anything, so you're going to get it. The fact of the matter is that a whole lot of Christians in Eastern Europe, in Russia, in Cuba, and China does not share the same sentiment as the Nepalese. As a matter of fact, the stories where if you went to church, it was basically impossible for you in Eastern Germany to go to university. The amount of churches that were converted into atheist museums in Russia. So there's a massive antagonism towards Christianity as well. At least from classical Marxism, and that's where I'm interested to figure out where's this thing going.
So if I can say about that, obviously that's true. I wouldn't want to minimize what the Nepali church went through. In terms of people who know suffering and who know persecution. But I can totally understand that if you grew up in the Soviet bloc, that would be a hard kind of step to make. I think that's bad administration of Marxism. I think it's a bad application of it. But I understand classical Marxism, hostile to religion, although it has to be said, Engels was quite warm to it, at least to the church, if not to its beliefs. And I know a lot of people like that. So for me, when I occupy spaces with leftists, I also want to give them a better picture of what Christianity is. I think saying there's a whole bunch of people who would disagree is kind of like, well, yeah, there's a whole bunch of people who think to be a Christian you need to support Donald Trump. Okay, we can have the conversation. I don't think that ends the conversation. Has the church been persecuted under communism? Yes, absolutely. I do fully understand why we care more about that than about the people in the developing world who have obliquely been oppressed by capitalism, by the artificial shortages, by the denationalization and privatization of things that should be public goods because of the Washington Doctrine. The effect of globalized capitalism on the world and the number of deaths and the amount of suffering and needless poverty that it's resulted in doesn't feel like a success to me. It's kind of like when you talk, and this is going to open another can of worms, but like we always care about the persecuted church unless they're Palestinians. It's that kind of vibe. Like we care about the persecuted if they fit our narrative. I'm not going to say it's okay to persecute people because of their religion. I don't fully understand, if we care that much about persecution on the basis of religion, why we're not speaking out more against the Muslims around the world who are being persecuted, or the Jehovah's Witnesses who really get it the worst. But I realize that's a kind of straw man response. Okay. But I do ask those questions because I think the reason people get so exercised about it is because they've already decided on the answer.
Well, I mean, to be fair, look, I'm not. It's very unfair because I'm not defending anything. I'm just the guy asking the questions. But I do think that there is a bit of a difference between concentration camps and re-education camps and people falling through a system. Now that doesn't mean that the people falling through that system that it's okay and that it doesn't need rethinking, but I do think that... Does
it make a difference to the people on the end, or are you speaking from a position of privilege? Because if my child, if I watch them waste away before my eyes because of lack of food, while in the West or even in my own country there are mountains of food spoiling, but I don't get to feed my child because I don't have the requisite capital to stay rich, then I'm going to say the motivations mean very little to me. And it's an ivory tower privilege that suggests otherwise.
Okay, so maybe one thing that'll help us, Jonty, to go forward is the fact that it's sometimes difficult for me when we're having conversations, especially as Marxism is something that is becoming quite popular. Recently, Teen Vogue. I'm not sure if you're a subscriber. But
I love Teen Vogue. Teen Vogue is the best. Teen Vogue is the most socially conscious magazine in the universe. I cannot believe they're doing so much of a better job than most of the regular news media. It's amazing. Their commentary is... Mwah.
Well, yeah, okay. I thought I was making a joke, but apparently
Teen Vogue are genuinely, they're there, dude. Like some of their... the best article I ever read on Antifa was by Teen Vogue. And this is a very serious kind of I don't know how this happened, but apparently it did. So, yeah.
Well, the point what I want to make is that it's obvious that, especially among the millennials and young people, Marx is becoming very popular again. And the one thing that really annoys me in the conversations that we're having with when you have a discussion on Marxism with friends, is the fact that when I talk to somebody who's positive about the free market, they don't necessarily quote Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, verbatim or whatever. It's as if they've moved on, and they'll use different arguments why they are passionate about the free market. But one thing about Marxism or Marxists today is that they almost quote Marx verbatim, and it's as if the way that they appropriate it is as if the capitalism that they are critiquing is still the capitalism of no minimum wages, no trade unions, child labor laws, nothing like that. So and it seems like the world has moved on a little bit. So shouldn't...
No, it hasn't. It hasn't. It's moved on for you, Johan. It hasn't moved on in Bangladesh. It hasn't moved on in much of Latin America. It hasn't moved on in much of South Asia. And the reason it hasn't is because it benefits us and because the capitalist system requires it to. So it hasn't moved on. Union members are being shot by Coca-Cola sponsored death squads. Do you know what I mean? Like people who argue for the minimum wage, an Oxfam representative, Oxfam's a big global organization, was killed because of her advocacy for workers' rights. I think in Brazil, I think it was just a few years ago. And this happens all the time. We are in a world where that is still the reality. It's just as a middle class person.
Okay, can we then have that conversation in a place like South Africa where we have those laws? Can I say, no, you are quoting Marx uncritically now. You're just using all
relevant
150 years ago. So please just.
I don't know anybody who quotes Marx except on actual communist meme pages. And even then, the thing that you see most often is like, guys, read the theory, stop doing just the memes. Legitimately, I consider myself to be a socialist and definitely warm to Marxist ideas and Marxist analysis. I wouldn't be able to quote much to you from it. I even broke out my Communist Manifesto to try and remember the passages that I found so inspiring. I couldn't really find them, and I was like, ugh, I don't want to be that guy. I don't think they're attracted to Marx. I think there's a small kind of coterie of people who are, because they like to have a strong leader and they like to, have someone to quote, and they want to profit, dude. I think there's something in us that likes the religious element of liberation. So of course you want to quote the great people. Also, if you feel a little bit inadequate in yourself to articulate it, having somebody else to articulate your thoughts, like Jordan Peterson, Dr. Phil, like Live, Laugh, Love posters, like whatever, like somebody else has articulated the thing that you've been feeling in your feels.
No, sure. I think the point is just when it comes to something like economic theory that is so dynamic, it helps to say, look, this is what these guys said, but we need to understand that the world, or not the world, sorry, that these countries might have moved on.
Yeah.
I don't think that England looks exactly the same as the England that Marx criticized.
No.
So otherwise,
yes and no. So I totally agree, and I think quoting Marx at people is stupid. It's kind of like quoting the Bible at people who don't believe in the Bible. Like, okay, nice, I don't care. Like my non-Christian friends, if I was like, but did you not know that in Matthew Jesus says, and then be like, that is awesome for Matthew, and it's the same thing. Why would anybody care what Marx said, or like attaching a quote to it? Like, make the argument for sure. I think when you say they're not quoting Adam Smith, no, they're not, because the entire of the discipline of economics currently is almost overwhelmingly just shades of capitalist. So, and I mean, there have been notable exceptions, obviously, in terms of Herman Daly, and there have been some really good kind of more, World Bank economists who have been more kind of realistic about the fact that you can't just have constant growth. And I'm trying to think of, there's been a few who have been part of that kind of movement away from that. But generally speaking, you don't have to quote, specific people talking against the thing that is in power. I would also say in Britain, is it like that? I don't know. Right now, we have a whole bunch of people who have no job security, no pension. They're working on 0-hour contracts. And they are the people who, at the beginning of lockdown, were continuing to work and their jobs weren't being protected, while landlords were given a rebate and people who owned homes were given a pause on having to pay their mortgages, while the people who were earning minimum wage in our shopping centers were the ones being coughed on by a constant stream of people hoarding toilet paper. The class divide has not disappeared as much as we would like to think of it if we have grown up middle class, if our jobs are white collar, if we live in a society where we are separated from having to stare the poverty in the face so much. I know you get to stare it more in the face in South Africa, but I grew up there too. And I remember people bitching about how tough it is to be a white South African while their maid brought them the cool drink by the pool.
I'm afraid it still happens.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, I want to push back and say I don't think what you just described is anywhere close to the horrors of the Industrial Revolution.
Of course. And do you know why?
I
Because
think
Marxism made gains.
It is important. I'll respond to that in a second. I think it is important to just say, in this current world of outrage, that we have made significant strides. And that's something that really annoys me, in as much as you call yourself a leftist Christian. Is let me just pick up on the leftist tagline there, is that we can acknowledge progress in so many different places.
Yes, absolutely.
Just to lament and say that it is the worst it's ever been. And
it's not true. We've made such progress. We have eliminated a lot of poverty.
And I think in that sense, Marxism is a good conversation partner for what you say is this dominant, let's say, free market theory that holds sway. And in that sense, it is good to have this other guy asking questions.
Yeah.
I mean, I think few people would disagree with that. And especially, I mean, I haven't read a lot of Zizek, but what I hear, what he says is that, yeah, look, he just doesn't agree with Fukuyama saying it's the end of history. He
obviously.
more can still happen. Now,
although Fukuyama was right about the Great Disruption, side note, but just about this, he was just way too early and didn't anticipate coronavirus, but yeah.
Well, the point is that for Zizek and perhaps the little bit of I understand of Eagleton, I don't want to embarrass myself. It seems like these guys say, look, we're just saying that to just say liberal democracy and the free market, that we've arrived. Let's not celebrate it yet.
Yeah.
This is a good conversation partner. But that's a far cry from just saying we need to adopt communism.
Yeah, I think for me, it's a question of how far you want to push it and what you think the risks are. I think a conversation partner that asks those questions and that reminds us when we start saying, but we're fine, and having somebody like I just said to you, are we? Or have we outsourced our problems? Are we talking from a position of privilege? I think that's part of it. I think adopting socialism to some extent, I think a lot of very successful countries have done that. They have very high standards of living. They are successful.
So we can even say that people who are so excited about just hardline capitalism, that hardline capitalism almost doesn't exist in the world anymore.
No, because there's so much socialism for big business, obviously. You know, a bank goes down and we're all going to pay for it. Obviously, if you're poor on your own, then we're capitalist. But for big business, we're socialist. Like, too big to fail. We couldn't possibly let those guys go down. We have to. I'm in a country right now where they are making interventions where you have multi-billion-pound organizations applying for relief under a system that is meant for small businesses. Where you've got companies like Amazon paying literally zero tax, Starbucks, you know, or having the government, Treasury, the taxman saying to the taxman here, listen, we think this is what's reasonable for us to pay, because they found all the loopholes, because they've decided to register themselves in the Cayman Islands and wherever, where they're not contributing to the running of a society that makes their wealth and their success possible. And then they have the gall to dictate terms in terms of the tax that they pay. Could you do that? My problem is that when people call themselves capitalists, they're not capitalists. Most of them don't have any capital. They're not rich. They're not going to succeed in this. They're just weirdly fighting for an ideology that doesn't care about them. And I find that weird.
Okay, but in as much as that ideology says that, look, you can have freedom. So, for example, in Zimbabwe, that's it is unfair to use the worst examples to prove a point. But in Zimbabwe, they nationalized the land, and it's a very lucrative tool to maintain power for the government, because if you speak out against the government, then we're just going to take your land back, because you do not have any security of property. You must watch what you say. Yeah. So in that sense, you can understand why people say, look, I'm a little bit worried about this heavy nationalization of everything, because with that comes a lot of power, but with let's say property rights, again, with all the clauses and be careful and whatever, one can say it does provide a sense of freedom where you can feel like you can speak out without fear of the government coming to sort out this naughty citizen.
I think it's a very specific situation of either very poor subsistence people or middle class people who are doing all right, where the owning of property is your source of security. I think there's something very wrong with a society where if you don't own property, you have no security anyway, and that's, by the way, what capitalism gives you. I don't own any property. That's not a righteous decision of mine. I just made some poor decisions, and it was because I was a Christian. I was like, we shouldn't plan for the future, and then I realized you're being a dumbass. But at that point, it was too late. Okay, I think one, the property issue, you should look into Henry George as a philosopher who talks about not owning land and land value taxes. He was a contemporary of Marx. He disliked Marx. He disliked capitalism as well, and he said that it all came down to land value. So the monopoly board is not a Marxist idea at the beginning; it's a Georgist idea. So that's a side note. The question of should you have that thing? For me, when you say it's bad to nationalize things, I'm going to go.
No. I'm not saying it's bad to nationalize things. I think it's bad to nationalize everything, and one can see that it. At certain places.
But can we say that some? So, for instance, I don't know many people who'd go like, I don't think we should nationalize the police, and yes, hierdie blerrie ANC hulle nationalize the fire department, why would that be bad? So then we think about, why is it good to have that? So that everybody has equal access to it in a democracy. I'm not talking about some other kind of thing, but in a democracy where we all have an equal stake, in theory, in the government, in the running of our affairs. At least we have to bow to the will of the majority of people. All that stuff that those lovely democratic revolutions fought for. Okay, in a country like that, why would you want the basics of life administered for profit rather than for everyone? Why would you want water privately owned when we all need water, unless you were pretty convinced you would always be able to afford it and you didn't care about the other people? This is my point as a Christian. Okay, we should be caring about the least of these. Yeah. Jesus defines our care for the poor, and I get that there's a question of like, should it be through the government or should it be through the good of our own hearts? By the way, if the goodness of our own hearts worked, we wouldn't have poverty right now because we've got enough billionaires. So it doesn't. But even so, if Jesus defines the welfare of the poor and taking care of them in Matthew 25 at such a high level that he identifies it with salvation. Okay, which I find problematic as an evangelical, I'm not going to lie, because I'm like, well, when are they going to say the prayer? They're going to say the prayer at some point, because if they don't say the prayer, they're not saved.
By grace alone, what's going on?
Legit, exactly. It's a conflicting message and all of that. But the point is, Jesus' heart here is you take care of them. What is more efficient, having this wealth accumulating in areas and then going to beg to the people to give you some of that wealth, or saying some things should be publicly owned? And by publicly owned, we don't mean by the government. We mean by us, because we are the government.
Well, again, I want to push you to just nuance one or two things. So, for example, here in South Africa, a lot of churches and NGOs mobilized themselves to distribute food parcels during the pandemic. Now, food parcels isn't a great way of development, but it's panic.
How's that going to alleviate long-term poverty?
No, it's not. But it's a pandemic, so we can't alleviate long-term.
I work for a mission agency that's doing exactly the same stuff, because you're just trying to keep people alive. So I get it. Yeah. Sorry for being sarky.
And then, and then the government said that they must, whatever the churches are doing, they must just take those parcels to the government warehouse, and they will do the distribution from there. And I, at this moment, and that to me sounds like a very Marxist move. And as a Christian, I have to say, no, there's just no way I'm going to do that.
What if they're better at it? Then why, as a Christian, would you object? Because what networks, what resources, and what are your criteria for taking to people aside from the people that we know? And what's more effective? So working for an NGO an INGO, an international mission agency, where we do relief work all the time. So you're working within kind of relief standards. You ask a lot of questions about a relief situation or even a development situation. You ask, is it sustainable? Who are the people who are benefiting? How have they been chosen? Is there a case of nepotism? Is there a case that we might actually be giving stuff to people who don't need it the most? Like there is a mindset. That's a mindset.
So our process is to get the churches on the ground in the townships to distribute it themselves. Yeah. So that's what we did.
That's good. That's good process.
The reason
do you think
why,
all of them are doing it?
Well, no, but the fact of the matter is that there were numerous reports that if you were not politically connected. So, for example, when I went into the township, it was very interesting to see that whilst these food delivery trucks came in, all of a sudden, the most I've ever seen them were wearing their ANC memorabilia, clothes, and dressed to the T, just to show that they are deserving of food parcels.
Yeah, and that's awful.
Something that can happen, because with that comes a lot of power, and the church, in that sense, is a good way of saying no. We're not going to bow to government, because
you've never encountered a church handing out charity on the basis of whether people truly deserve it. You don't think the church has a history? And I used to work for 6 months for a homeless charity in Reading. Okay, so you meet the guys on the street. The number of Christian volunteers who would come out and a guy would go, "Can I please have 2 spoons of sugar?" And they would be affronted that a homeless person dared to ask for 2 spoons of sugar, as if they weren't a human being with tastes, who would get annoyed if he didn't want that sandwich, he wanted a cheese sandwich. The myth of the deserving and undeserving poor in Victorian England was a Christian propagated myth. I see churches in the UK, good people wanting to do good things, who get involved in relief and development situations overseas because they don't honestly know what they're doing. This is not the majority by any means, but occasionally you've seen it, sending huge crates full of shoes to tsunami-ravaged areas, not only providing a thing that is next to useless to those people, but also destroying every shoemaker's business for miles. Instead of sending money to buy local, that kind of thing. Like, you can't expect people who want to put something in a shoebox and send it to somebody who want to sponsor a child to understand sustainable development. Now, I'm not saying that you can't get that with government.
Relief organization, I mean, they've done a lot of, they've caused a lot of damage, and even our little NGO, we've made a lot of mistakes, and we continue to make a lot of mistakes. That's part of the thing. But it's also interesting that, not interesting, I think just worth noting, and maybe that's why the dogmatic buttons are pressed when I see a government move like that. It's just in the past where in other communist regimes, they refuse the church from caring for the poor because it's the state,
which is ridiculous. And but you have the opposite in the States, and with hardcore kind of capitalists where they're like, no, they will actually agree with you. And I have friends and people who I really like, who we've had this conversation with, are like, yes, we must care for the poor, but the way we do that is not through government. And they're just as dogmatic about the fact that, or the idea that, a government couldn't possibly do it well. And there is a leftist thing that I think can be taken too far, that says, why should we have to beg for your charity when this should be everyone's? When it is obviously obscene for one individual to have as much wealth as Jeff Bezos, while applying for tax relief and relief for his things, and advising his own workers in his company to live off food stamps.
Yeah.
Like sharpen the guillotines. Not really. I am a pacifist. But
look, I mean, I'm a Christian talking to. I'm not a capitalist. I'm not defending. Well,
no. Sorry, I'm not. When I get worked up, this is not at you, Johan. You're a very
reasonable. No, relax. I'm not offending. I'm just saying that I can obviously see that Jeff Bezos is not the best way to go. But the
system makes him inevitable.
But then I can.
It tends to monopoly.
But then I can also look at the abuse of communism, and I can say, yeah, I'm not comfortable with that either. So I guess I'm just trying to get you to acknowledge that, look, this thing, in as much as we try to be classical about it, in as much as we just want to be ideologically pure, is not good enough. We need to appropriate it. We need to be smart about it.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I don't want to. I don't want to ruin the conversation here by agreeing with you. So, like, I'll kind of quietly, like, face to face. Yeah, but I do agree. I do think that you can't just go kind of hard line at it for sure. I do think that we stop too short. And I think there's a thing that happens in communist circles where they're super hostile to charity. To NGOs, they hate it because they say what you're doing is propping up the failing system. What you're doing is making sure that the poor don't rise up and overthrow a system that tends to monopoly, that tends to a lack of choice despite its own propaganda, that tends to inefficiency despite its own propaganda. You're making it less likely for them to rise up and change the world. And therefore, you have people who claim to be like Zizek, who claim to be a kind of accelerationist and who want that revolution to come sooner. So yay, Trump, because ultimately this is going to make people take to the streets. I think that's cool, but I haven't seen any barricades being raised on the street yet. And there are still people dying. There are still people suffering. There are still people in this capitalism-ridden world who are, and not just capitalism, but monarchy and all the other kind of like unjust systems where the poor are trampled on in a way that the prophets speak about, in the way that Amos speaks about in a kind of brutal way. Like you've got all of these people suffering still, and I would rather help them than see the end goal and sacrifice them. And I get that macro politics ends up.
But in that sense, Jonty, you are moving away again from classical Marxism, because I think
as a Christian you have to.
Yeah, thank you. All right.
Yeah, I think so. And for me, the same thing. Yeah, we'll go home now. We'll go have a beer. Yeah. No, but for me,
let me just. Sorry, I'm asking the question, so I can.
Sorry.
Cut you short. It's fun. Jonty, so the one thing that is problematic is that, in as much as this thing is a dialectical materialism and this thing is inevitable and needs to go, it means that your epistemology and your moral epistemology eventually hinges on anything that is good for the revolution is good, anything that is bad for the revolution is bad. And that's why these guys would look at a specific event, like a, let's say, a micro event, where we say, look, we need to help these guys, they are starving. And in their mind, you know what, if you as an NGO are just propping up this situation, then you are going to stop the revolution. Whereas a Christian, we would say, there was a poor guy who came to me and I had to feed him.
I think that poor guy, that Christian, is maybe missing a trick just as much as the communists are. Because it is neither good enough to go, we're going to let him starve, or it's that Bishop Tutu thing, and I'm just going to feed him. Of like, if you keep on having to pull bodies out of the river, maybe go upstream and see why they're falling in. You know, like that's deal with the causes. And to be honest, the big NGOs are doing this. This is why they've come under so much attack by right-wing media, is because they are campaigning far more than they ever did before, because they're saying, we're feeding these people, we're doing development, but we can't keep up with the damage that's being done. So can you please change your policies? Now, there are communists who'd be like, that is too centrist. And I'm not a lover of centrism. That is too, I don't know, you're compromising. I think whatever gets the job done, and aim for something larger. I think if you are saying, if it's in the cause of the revolution, then it's acceptable. No. If you're saying, on balance, this is going to help people more, I can see that some tough moral decisions will have to be made. I'm a pacifist, so I don't want violence to overthrow the dominant system, because I don't want to see a person made in the image of God made to suffer, or have their life cut short. I don't believe we have the right to do that. I find it weird that, you know, people who believe in the death penalty, or, you know, wars generally, are so squeamish when it comes to Marxists doing it. Yeah, for real. Like, but for me, I want to avoid that if we can. So I'm still voting, you know, and I'm voting left as much as I can. But I don't think it's just a case of just do the feeding and just vote. Voting is once every 4 years or 5 years. Feeding is not a long-term solution. And I think with the best will in the world, sometimes it helps us maintain a feeling of power and that dynamic of power, because people have to tell me what a good person I am. And I'm not talking about is it a good deed if you're doing it for yourself? I'm talking about the power dynamic of keeping people dependent on you and thankful, rather than the power dynamic of empowering them and enabling them to take control of their own destiny. I don't want a world where I have to be generous, like, in order to make people live. I want them to have the power to call me a douchebag if they want, and not worry that they're not going to be fed. All those dynamics that you're talking about, I think, exist inherently in relying on charity to solve poverty. And I work for a charity, and I am so committed to it, you cannot believe. But I think a better world would be where we didn't have to provide medical care, because the world trade system was organized so that African countries could be strong enough, and their own economics hadn't been hollowed out by people who had come from the US and demanded that they privatized essential services, like in the 60s, or the 70s or the 80s.
I feel empowered, Jonty, by being able to do things. Now, look, you're going to probably pick up on the power. But be careful.
Of course I
am. But I feel empowered when I think, I need to change. I need to do certain things in myself. Whereas taken to its extreme, if there's just this system that we allow to
do you think that's a risk? I know where you're going with this. And then where will be the thing? It's kind of like that old cliche, which is I find it one of the most annoying, which is like, communism is nice in theory, but it doesn't take human nature into consideration. It's such nonsense. Communism specifically takes human nature into consideration and says people will not share by choice. So we will make them share, because it is worth them losing the agency around sharing to make sure that people don't suffer. And I guess it's that sense of, how much do you value being able to feel like a good person? How much do you value that sense of empowerment in changing or in acting or in doing all that kind of stuff? And is it really worth more than ending the suffering of another human being long term? And I'm not saying I know it's not an easy choice. I know it's not a simple choice like that. But for me, that's the real question.
Yeah, I guess I think it is a false dichotomy, because I mean, you are involved in charity would know that the changing happens within the person who is trying to bring the relief. We are the ones being changed. We are not.
In certain models. In other models, in really effective models, actually you're empowering people to help each other and help themselves, and it becomes less about you. And I think that's the thing. Now, working in the development sector and in the charity sector, my wife works for a big INGO. Like, you hear the self-hating development person talking all the time, going like, but we still have some power. We're still making these decisions. So that must be bad because we're Western and we're Northern and a lot of us are white and we come from the middle class. So this must be in some way oppressive. And I'm like, maybe, and we definitely should be critiquing that. We definitely should be getting better at it. When I see people doing very handout, top-down, the power dynamic is really a little bit messed up kind of charity, I'm like, yeah. But a lot of the time, I'm like, guys, chill out and help the people, you know, because your self-critique is making you weaker in that area.
Yeah. But the last point I just want to make, and you don't even have to respond, is that if we only going to pick up on systems, and we're only going to say, you know what, the system is the problem, then I'm never going to do anything. It's that Solzhenitsyn quote, right? The line dividing good and evil runs through every human heart. And I think there's a big ivory tower academic discussion about the system is this, the system is so against us. And then those people do nothing. They smoke cigars and they've got this whole French street cafe thing going, and just critiquing the system, and the system must go down. But they don't do anything because the system is so big. It's this massive monster. There's no need of me trying to do anything.
Yeah. But this is exactly a discussion that's happening within leftist circles, and it's a real tension and it's a real fight. Is you got a lot of people turning to anarchism and going, screw it, we're not going to engage anymore. We're going to be disruptive. We're going to attack the enemies. We're going to I like anarchists. I just think it's a bit juvenile. I think they don't smoke. That's not PC. That's really not true. Look at a picture of Che Guevara. So I think the main thing that I would say is when you say, are we in danger of getting to a point where, where we get to a society where there's no place for us to actually act as Christians in generosity and love? I'm going to say, I'm willing to take the risk about getting there because it doesn't seem like that's a massive danger. That thing in the Screwtape Letters where C.S. Lewis says, or the devil, who is it? Is it Screwtape? Says the thing that you want to do is to make them focus on the thing that is the least likely to be a danger. So like, in a licentious age, make them worry about Puritanism. Or in this case, like in a world so unbelievably divided by inequality, make people worry that it'll be so equal that it'll be a little bit boring. Like, it's not really a danger, guys. And I think what was the next thing you said? It was about, sorry, it totally went out of my mind.
Well, personal reform. In other words,
personal reform. Yeah. So you can sit thinking about the system, and you could end up doing nothing. And again, this is where I think Christians can catalyze it, because Christians generally have an activist tendency. Now, it has to be said,
and when you are, they do both. So as you said, Amos, the prophets, that's the system is wrong.
Yeah,
then Jesus comes into a very problematic system, the Roman Empire, and he says, "No, you're the problem. Take the log out of your own eye."
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he is
intention.
Jesus is almost universally disappointing to your expectations of him, I think, which is always quite cool. He gives you no quarter. He doesn't let anybody go away smug, which I love. I think if you're criticizing leftism for being too ivory tower and theoretical, I would ask you how many theology students changing the world, because I know a lot of them changing their churches, and that seems like a quite limited kind of area. Again, know a lot of theological students, like them very much. I edit a theology and philosophy magazine, which is all about the thinking, and I actively resist making the practical application part of it, because I think the life of the mind should trickle down into the way that we do things, from theory to praxis, if that's the right use of those terms. I don't think, if the problem is that we aren't promoting the theory into practice so much, I don't really understand why you had such a strong reaction just to the word Marxism on this invite. I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is we reject the theory because we worry about the way it's going to change the world. And we're either frightened, or we don't like it, or we've got a selfish aversion to it, or probably very legitimate concerns historically, or any of that sort of stuff.
Well, look, my challenge, we don't have to agree on this, but my challenge would be that in as much as you only see the problems as systemic, you've got this system and this system and this sense of this system, and it's so monstrous, it's so big, there's nothing you can do, then you're not going to do the stupid thing by just giving a little bit more of your salary.
Oh yeah. And that's the thing. So for me, like, you need to be giving more to charity. You do, as much as you can. And define can as well, because if it's as much as I can while maintaining the lifestyle of a king in any other age, then I'm going to say, I don't know. But don't pretend that the personal sacrifice is going to change the world. You're not going to fix climate change by changing your light bulbs. Do you know what I mean? And stopping flights. It's not going to happen. Similarly, you're not going to fix world poverty by you handing out an extra few rand to the car guard. That's not going to fix it. But you have to do both. Yeah, for real.
Both. Okay, cool. We agree on something. Jonty, this is getting boring. Last thing before we allow the other people to jump in is this. It seems like Marxist thought has been hijacked a little bit by identity politics. Okay, this has been well discussed. And I get the idea that you can be somewhat annoyed with identity politics. Maybe not. Maybe I'm just projecting. But one thing that I find interesting is that last year when we had the Women's Soccer World Cup, it was supposed to be about soccer, and people enjoyed the soccer, but it very quickly became about the gender pay gap and everything, and that it became an activist moment. Likewise, Serena Williams in that same year, doing very well, and she protested against the gender pay gap between women tennis players and men tennis players. But what I find interesting is that if you take the team that protested against the gender pay gap, the American female soccer team, one member, you can take any member in their soccer team, they earn more than the entire Banyana squad, okay? and it's this massive justice and
Oh,
human rights issue. Serena Williams is one of the highest paid people in the world. She's so deep into the 1%. It's not even funny.
Yeah.
But it becomes this justice issue, and it's weird that people are protesting about that, and it's this massive justice issue. But what about?
Well, you want some intertextuality, absolutely. I genuinely don't understand why anybody who plays sport is paid a particularly high amount of money, because I don't care about sport at all. So this is why I had to leave South Africa. So I would say that first of all. Secondly, I think the thing that I really find odd is when they're like, I can't believe that actresses on the red carpet are asked about their $20,000 dress. I'm like, this is not a justice issue. I find it really hard to care about some of the most overpaid people in society. However, when you say it should have been about sport and instead we made it about some social justice issue, it feels like what they used to say about apartheid and about the what is it, the sanctions on sports trips? What was that called? There was a word for it. I can't remember. So you couldn't. Yeah, the boycotts. That's right, the sporting boycotts. So I think it's really easy as a man to go, why are you bringing this up? It's so not important. Let's just watch the sport. Well, sure. And as much as I think professional sports people, or amateurs in the case of the Olympics, amateurs, and actors and all of this sort of stuff need to just have a long, hard look at themselves in the mirror and maybe slap themselves in the face a bit if they think that they are the victims of injustice in that sense. Though let's also talk about Me Too if we're going to talk about no injustice there. Let's not, because that's been talked about for ages. But at the same time, there are symbolic moments here that I think are quite useful. And the fact is, if you are paying people less for doing the same admittedly pointless, irrelevant thing, then you've got to ask why. And if it is just an indicator and a more visible indicator of something that is happening in the rest of society, then surely it's worth doing. Or at least using it to open up that conversation. My problem with identity politics, and I think a lot of Marxists, to be honest, have very little time for identity politics. I think the Marxists, the hard Marxists, are the one who are like, "Are you kidding me? This is about the working class, and we don't care."
My point,
but the left generally.
But my point is not that it's not a just issue for Serena Williams and these guys to argue against it. My argument is that it's funny that that's the argument, and it's completely gone away from starving people versus multi-billion.
Because I think it's easier for us. I think the white Western feminist. Now again, I think identity politics strays into some awkward areas where they start saying white Western women need to shut up in feminist spaces because black women have been silenced because of their poverty, because of racism, because of all that kind of stuff. I find that complicated, and I think honestly you guys are dealing with this a lot more than I am, because you've made some, in conversations with you and with your wife, you've made some very brave steps into having really hard conversations with people in the area of identity that I think that must have been so difficult. So I don't want to pontificate on this, but I would say that the problem for me is when you start saying somebody's opinion that is not about lived experience is less valuable because they are lower down on the hierarchy of suffering or disadvantage. I think for me, I am still enough of a classical liberal to want to hear the ideas regardless. I have a problem with some liberalisms because I think we can hide behind them to make sure that we stall change. And I would say that as growing up as a white South African, my natural inclination is not socialism. My natural inclination growing up in a non-Christian home in white South Africa that was kind of liberal was probably libertarianism. That's where I'd want to go. Leave me alone. Let me do what I want to do. Don't tell me how to run my life, and I'll leave you alone. I think that's a very, frankly, colonial mindset in the kind of like sociological kind of who we are, rather than the historic kind of sense. And I think that's perfectly fine. The reason why I moved away from that to a more communal ethic is because of Jesus. Is because I don't think that kind of leave me alone approach is good. It's why I don't really love the anarchists, is because they have a similar thing. It's why I don't love some aspects of Habermas, who you spoke to recently, is because there's this, let's model something different and then the world will catch on. How's that working? They don't care what we do. And similarly, you can't fix anything by just individual effort. I think we have to work together, and that's why.
Okay. Let's open it up, guys. If you have a comment or two, Jonty, I didn't realize that we've been talking for almost an hour straight, so my apologies that you guys had to listen to the two of us blabbering. But any questions? Please make Jonty earn his money.
Wait, I'm getting paid?
I gave a call to Jeff Bezos. He's sponsoring this. Make sure it goes into a savory direction. Just unmute yourself, and then if you have a question, you can just do that. Otherwise, Andre, I'm not sure who's on YouTube. You can just maybe relay some of the questions.
We're on YouTube. Hey, YouTubers.
Jonty, Louise, go for it.
Hi. Yes, I've really loved what you said, and my comment about the smokers was about the academics. They're too afraid to smoke these days. No, we know old Jay loved to have his cigar. Now, I'm also a Christian, but I come from a totally different academic background. I'm a Nietzsche scholar. So that is the other end of the Hegelian spectrum. Yeah. And I would just like to ask you about, you use the phrase about, how problematic the phrase human nature is in these days. And you said that we should look again at the statement, humans don't like share, etc., etc. I have to say, I find that rather problematic. And I think the reason why people fear Marxism, why it has acquired ever since the 1950s in America and in South Africa, sort of like the rooi gevaar, the red danger, is because Marxism isn't just an economic theory. The problem that I have with Marx as a philosopher is that of the three hermeneuticians of suspicion, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, Marx used the only one aspect, Freud to some extent as well, and tried to explain the totality of human existence according to economic theory. And I believe that's one of the reasons why Marxism descended into totalitarianism. And there's just one thing that I want to add to that. I do believe that contemporary, even honest Marxists like yourself, you still mention the concept of revolution, and so does Zizek. I talked to him about this when I was
name dropping there.
Yes, nice. Well, Johan, you know me. Tickets.
That's very cool.
Money. I wanted to get my money's worth, but I'm finishing you. But he used the example of Zimbabwe as an example of the people taking back their land, and he considered it successful. So I think that even today, Marxism, and this is the only criticism that I have against what you said, I basically agree with you 90%, is that even that, yes, it is. And Johan, you know how aggressive I can get, so you can count this as a win too. But you've basically mentioned three, the limitations of three forms of three, shall we say, spaces to address poverty, and that's charity, the markets, of course, you've said from the beginning, are insufficient, and then the state. But I think even latter-day Marxists are still too cagey about the state's failure. and also in South Africa. What would your response be to that?
Okay, I think for me, the state, first of all, what you said about reducing everything to economics, I agree. And I'm a Christian. So in kind of, I say in Marxist spaces, like I'm, going to the salons and talking to them. Obviously, that's not happening, but it's meme pages, guys. That's where it's happening now. And in those spaces, I think I always get uncomfortable when things get reduced to revolution and to economics. However, I do think that it's really easy for people to say money doesn't matter when they have a lot of it, which may be a trite way of putting that. But I think if you are aware and you care about the effects of economic injustice in the world, then you can't help but refer to it quite a lot. Even when you're thinking about Serena Williams and the very obvious problem of gender inequality in the world, and from that level to GBV and all that kind of stuff. Sorry. So reminding people of the economic issue, I think, is important. So first of all, I'd just say that's why I think, even though I don't think it should be everything, I think bringing it back to that quite often while people are still starving to death in a world with enough wealth, probably all right. In terms of being cagey about the failure of the state, I don't know, there's so many variables in any state failure. It's really quite hard to pin it on one thing. Is the state going to be perfect at administering everything? Like I say, I am naturally a libertarian. I hate bureaucracy. I've been to the Department of Motor Vehicles out there in Silverton and wanted to, take up arms at that point. I get the hatred of bureaucracy. I get the hatred of big state to an extent. I also had my life saved by the NHS here for free. I got diagnosed on a Thursday. I had my operation on a Tuesday. I had all of that for free, while my dad was fighting with his medical aid about whether or not they would give him the treatment that would cure his cancer. So for me, the state, maybe we need to be more I'm happy to say the state is not perfect, but then my response is not, I guess we just don't rely on them at all. My response is, well, let's find ways to make it better, because we have a lot more ability to change that in a democracy than we do to change the minds of people who are only beholden to shareholders.
Absolutely. Could I just say something very quickly about Max Weber, and then I will keep quiet, I promise. Now, you've used the example of the NHS and the local case in Silverton. And I'm pretty sure you know where this is going, but we have to take into account, I'm sure you've read Max Weber's Protestantism in America. In fact, Weber's idea is, and he was an atheist, by the way, is that particular people's economic attitude is shaped primarily by their religious and cultural attitudes. And in other words, the non-material phenomena heritage shapes the material result.
Cool.
Isn't Marxism just a little bit too huge and amorphous? Shouldn't it pay more attention to local conditions and cultural heritages? Because I think that, as romantic as it may be to link something like Ubuntu with Marxism, I think one of the reasons in South Africa why the ANC in particular is failing is because they don't have a heritage of or haven't developed an efficient or a particular a culture where an efficient bureaucracy is valued. Well, you could say no one ever has, but it's particularly bad in South Africa.
Yeah.
There's a difference there's a huge difference between being irritated in England, and here you have corruption to an extent that some people have said that we will see the demise of the state in the future in a way that, and I don't mean this in the Marxist sense. I mean things like roads just falling apart, not because there isn't money, but it's simply lack of work ethic.
I think we've got it. Yeah, it might be a bit.
Can I just jump in, because I will forget, because my mind is like that. First of all, the idea that sounds cool, and I should read him. I haven't read him. Second of all, I think is it too big and amorphous to apply, and should you make it more local? Anarcho-syndicalism kind of operates, I think, on a similar level, and there's lots of different models that can localize it to local conditions. But I think what you're asking about is that kind of psychocultural mindset. I would say Latin America and Russia are quite different. I think socialism has taken hold in some ways, not full communism, obviously, but has taken hold in a lot of very different cultures. I think it has a universalism about it that may be incorrect, particularly to postmodernists who dislike those kinds of meta-narrative, or at least like large swathing answers to everything. But I think it's proved itself quite adaptable. I mean, you've got liberation theology that has adopted it. I think we're quite good at syncretism just as humans. So if your belief is Marxism, I think you can probably let stuff come in there. You're always going to have the Puritans. In terms of the difference and the states being undermined, if there's corruption, then corruption needs to be rooted out. But like, there's corruption in capitalist countries too. There's currently a cataclysm of poorly maintained bridges in the poster child for capitalism, the United States. Like, their public infrastructure has not been updated since FDR, that terrible socialist. I think what you need is a broader tax base. I think that requires, again, there's a lot of variables. I think you need a fair trade system internationally. I think you need to be taxing the wealthy and companies a lot more. I think it needs to be a global solution to be fully effective.
What is true, though, Jonty, is the fact that in America, there's a lot more freedom to criticize government for those failings than in many other communist countries. Where,
for now,
well, I mean, maybe that might be the no true Scotsman fallacy that I hear there. In any case, do we have any other questions? Louise, just wait for a moment. Let's see if any of the others. Nothing on
this
YouTube.
Is heartbreaking.
Herman.
Hello. So I'm not a political theorist at all, and I'm no fan of capitalism. But I just find it very difficult to kind of trust the Marxist or to embrace the Marxist idea of trusting the government. Not that I'm one of those American type people who don't trust the government, but government.
Arman, you're breaking up there.
It seems that you're placing a lot.
You're going to have to repeat that, Arman.
Okay. It seems like you're placing a lot of trust in a system that nowhere in the world really works. I mean, I struggle to think of good examples of successful Marxist countries at all. Even the socialist ones in Scandinavia are not Marxist. So I mean,
I'll take socialism. Go for socialism then. I totally sacrifice Marxism. Go for socialism. I think the reason why we don't trust governments is because they don't do very much for us, because they're currently orientated around propping up the market rather than the market being something that happens in them. I get the idea of not trusting a government. I do. I think I would say, though, that, again, in the case of the NHS, a government that I disliked, that was spending money on drone assassinations of people who disagreed with them and said things they didn't like and considered them enemy combatants in places like Pakistan and Yemen, where we weren't even technically at war with them. This is our capitalist UK and their commitment to free speech. While that government was doing that, that government also saved my life through the NHS, paid for by taxes. If we could just get basic infrastructure and the things that people need to stay alive paid for by taxes, I'd be happy with that. And I think you wouldn't need a revolution. I think inequality makes people angry, and capitalism tends to inequality. So when you say you haven't seen a working Marxist state, I'm going to say I haven't seen a capitalist state that doesn't externalize work to the point of near slavery, doesn't externalize misery to benefit a certain class of people in its own society. And for me as a Christian, I cannot say this is a successful state if there are people who are the least of these who are suffering. If as a society, we're saying to the naked, go away, I will not clothe you. To the hungry, go away, I will not feed you. Because we are doing that to Jesus. And for me, that can't be a successful society.
I mean, I agree with that, and I detest the super rich and the inequality and that kind of thing as well. But I just haven't seen the middle class being better off in Soviet Russia than they are in capitalist anywhere else.
I'm not concerned about the middle class.
Or the poor, for that matter. I mean,
so
poor are better off in capitalism. It seems.
No, they're not. They're not. So when and again, this is helpful to work for a World Mission Agency. So when you talk to people in Bangladesh who work in garment factories, I promise you those people are not better off because of capitalism's hold on that completely deregulated labor market. I promise you they're not better off. They are suffering because we are consuming clothes and not just because of the individual consumer, because it's so easy to go, oh, you didn't buy fair trade, so you enslaved that person, but because of that system. When we talk to people who are involved in the, this is years ago before anti-trafficking became cool. We were working with some anti-trafficking people in Albania. Okay, Albania is a massive, massive hub for trafficking young women into sex industry, slavery particularly. Also, side note, the church is concerned with human slavery or modern day slavery only ever being about sex work just makes it look like we only care about sex. It's weird. But anyway, we were working in this. It was actually about women who had been promised jobs and then they were trafficked into sex work. Okay. Horrific, horrific stories. I said, is this just endemic? I was interviewing people who were working with them on the ground, local people who had been working in Albania that had a fairly brutal form of communism under Hoxha, and also all his bunkers. Weird. That's a communist meme page joke, by the way, bunkers and Hoxha. Anyway, I mean, sorry, it's just you guys had some of the kind of niche stuff there with Weber. I've never read him, so I just wanted to chuck in some, anyway, point is, I asked them about that and they said, yeah, this started after the fall of communism, because up until that point, no family would sell their daughter for food because they had food. Not a lot, but they didn't have the level of poverty of, cool, you're on your own. Okay. These are former Soviet citizens saying, now we have this problem after the fall of communism. I'm not saying communism is a panacea. I'm not saying it was a delightful system to live under. I'm not saying there weren't any things happening that were horrific. I am saying that those are the situations that I've heard about around the world. And I think we're quite cloistered in our own experience of the world to go, well, this must be how everybody else is experiencing it. And it's not. When you've got people who are literally having their water sources taken away and privatizing literally rain. So you are not allowed to gather rainwater in a country that has made a deal with a French water company, which has come in under the capitalist system, working really well, global capitalism in places like Tanzania. Right. No, that happened.
No, okay. Sure, but I just think it's anecdotal. But that's
it's not anecdotal. Point. It's WaterAid's main campaign thing from a few years ago. They were talking about that.
To try and say that
It's an entire country. How is that anecdotal?
To use Bangladesh, I mean, we could use the Asian tigers as an example, because by every possible metric, those countries are doing far better than.
And do you know why? Countries. Do you know what they did? They closed their markets. They closed their markets for a period of decades, and they did public works. That's what they did, and then they opened their markets and they became the tigers.
Okay, debatable. Simon, you had a question.
Last question, and then I'll leave, or I'll stop. So I agree with you that those kinds of excesses of capitalism are obscene, but it seems to me like something that can be addressed by regulation. But regulation isn't the same thing as Marxism. Regulation just says that should be illegal, But I'm very much for more regulation in capitalist countries, but to me that doesn't concentrate power as it would in a Marxist system. So that's my last question. You can answer that.
Thanks. Thank you, and thank you for being so gracious. I think the concentration of power, because we are oh man, my mind just went blank. Sorry, can you repeat that question? Sorry. Oh, he's gone.
No.
About regulation.
Regulation. Thank you.
Regulation, yes.
Yeah. I think the regulation that you see here, so that you don't have children working down coal mines, was won by trade unions who were Marxists. The reason why you have a weekend is because of trade unions who were Marxists. Marxism may not be regulation, but it's a great orientation for regulation, saying that human beings are more valuable than product, saying that we need to limit the power of capital over human beings. I think that's a good orientation. If you're happy with more regulation, I'd say that's great. I still want to see redistribution. I don't think that wealth is the be all and end all. I have a slight problem with land, bread as a kind of thing that you're going to be chanting because like Louise said, there is more to life than just, that kind of totalizing system. And like Johan said, not everything can be reduced to economics. But I do think that it's really easy to say that when you're not hungry. And I want to see redistribution. I want to see nationalization of the things that are essential to all of us. And I want to see a really great argument for why we shouldn't nationalize things rather than the other way around, I guess.
Simon.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the question is, and maybe I'm not familiar with the nuanced Marxist revisionist positions, but I mean, you've mentioned there people who have said that in a communist country they were at least able to get a meal.
Yeah.
But I mean, part of the legacy of communism and the reason why it terrifies so many people is precisely because millions of people starved to death in those countries. The Ukrainians, most of the people I believe who died in a Mao were farmers who were forced to make steel.
Who refused to share.
Yeah. So, I mean, you could say, well, there's an example here of some people in Bulgaria that at least had some meals. But I mean, you could find situations of starvation and poverty on a par with any of these areas which have been affected by the excesses of capitalism.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been to Russia myself, and I've seen the poverty in places like Siberia, and it's no better there than any other place.
I mean, Russia's not communist anymore, right?
Sorry?
Russia's not communist anymore, right?
No, I understand that, but I mean, you can see in the ravages of it. I mean, you go to a lot of countries and you can see things don't just deteriorate like that overnight. You can see.
I think you'll find they can, first of all, but I get your point. I think there's a few things. One, when you have the entire might of the Western world and their wealth trying to isolate you, you're probably going to lose, and you're probably going to find it difficult. I think if you have a psychopath running your country, who is letting his personal paranoia guide his policy decisions, that may be a problem. I guess for me, I can go by the people who I've spoken to and by the resurgence in belief in socialism in countries where people used to have a safety net and they don't. And I guess my thing is just every time we talk about the failures of capitalism, we go, well, then we must reform it. You know, we must find a better way to do it. And we've had how long? You know, of everybody going, okay, this is the only game in town, and we're just going to try and make it work. But still you see the starvation, still you see the lakes of milk and the mountains of food rotting while people starve to death. You know, still you see countries forced to open their markets so that they will never produce a damn thing they consume. They'll just hand over their natural resources to have somebody else process it and sell it to them at a profit. Like, you still see the gap growing more and more. For me, like, why do we always say, let's reform capitalism? Why don't we say, okay, if there was examples of communism that didn't work, why don't we try a little bit of that reforming of that?
No, I agree with you that certainly that's the case, that we see excesses and wastage of goods. And certainly I think Marx was the one who pointed out that one thing that capitalism is very good at is making stuff. In fact, it makes too much stuff. But if we are to revise a system or seek to revise it, then you're still going to need, whatever the system be, you're still going to need the engine room to produce the stuff to feed the people who are at the bottom end of the line.
Yeah. And I just want that engine room to be feeding them and not have to also feed shareholders.
Okay, so I understand that needs to be done, and certainly as a Christian as well, I agree with your take on the scriptures, that the scriptures is very serious about people who are downtrodden, and so I do think that there's some merit here. My concerns are trying to figure out what aspects of Marx's economic policies should be accepted. I mean, for example, one of the things that's the most secure thing for any person in these poor countries is just that he's got his little piece of land that he can farm. And so, I mean, Johan's just been to Zimbabwe now and looked at examples of it. Now, of course, I understand that there's things factoring into it, but at least for the person who has a piece of, acre, he can grow his maize, he can have his chickens, he can provide for himself. So I'm trying to figure out, because classic communism rejects property, title, and profit.
It rejects private property, not personal property. So you still get to get a toothbrush. I think for me, I wouldn't idealize subsistence living. If subsistence living was so great, and I mean, I've got my little plot of land and I can feed my family. It is better than what land enclosures and private land enclosures did to most of those peasants. Definitely in this country, the great enclosures is what they were called, actually, so that people could have more land to graze their sheep. People were forced into the urbanization trap where they were living in poverty and where they had to accept any wage whatsoever because they couldn't feed themselves. And that's basic free market economics. Labor gets cheaper as people have fewer choices in terms of feeding themselves. So I get that, but I also think that when you see people in the developing world now, a lot of young people are not wanting to live a life of hand-to-mouth existence, just feeding themselves. They want to flourish as human beings. And as a Christian, I think, as a Marxist, I'm like, as long as they're eating, that's fine. As a Christian, I think they need more, So for me, the aspects that you're... Sorry.
I think I understand not everybody wants to grow potatoes and maize, and that's fine. But I mean, just having a piece of property that's yours, that you have ownership on, and you're a tradesman, you're a craft, you're an art, whatever it is, you stitch shoes, whatever your trade is, whatever your skills are, you at least have a domain or a thing that's yours for which you can then...
How do you achieve that if most of the land is owned by multinational corporations, by hereditary family ownership, where it's just being passed down from generation to generation or shareholder board to shareholder board? Like, at that point, I'm going to say, you nationalize the land and you hand out little parcels to everybody. Now, ideally, you don't do it like the psychopath in Zimbabwe. But if that's your dream, then cool. Take away from large landowners. Mao would be happy. I would too. I don't understand why one person or one family should own huge swathes of land if that is your ideal.
Yeah, but you see, I think here's the rub. So in that scenario, if you nationalize the land, and if you have it such that the state then parcels out land to people to live in and to do their work or whatever, the problem then is that when those citizens take issue and critique the government, then that becomes weaponized against them. In fact, I remember having this conversation with a woman when I was in Russia in St. Petersburg, where they were given a flat. And during her time, her husband was an intellectual and author, and he wrote a book in which was critical. This is the period of perestroika and all that.
Yeah.
And they just turned around and just demoted him and kicked him out of the flat. I mean, and there was nothing.
But he still had a flat. He just had a less nice flat. He wasn't on the street. See, what happens here is you argue with your boss, and he goes, "You're fired," and you now can't make your payments, or you can't afford rent. If I argue with my boss and I annoy him enough, he will fire me and I will be homeless because I rent. Because most people rent in capitalism.
But you see the difficulty here is suppose you say, well, the guy in Russia went from a nice flat to a hole, okay, to live in, okay.
Sure.
And you say to him, well, that's at least nice, but what do you do? What's to prevent the guys who are running the state?
The law.
From just saying,
the law. I have benefited. Again, I criticize the government here all the time. I criticize it publicly. I was called the Baptist Times Weekly News Communist by some critic. I had people writing, telling me to resign all the time. I was writing for the Huffington Post. I was writing for the Evangelical Alliance. I was writing for a whole bunch of very public things. Admittedly, my audience was tiny because I'm not important, okay? But the point is, in that analogy, I didn't have healthcare withheld from me. Why? Because of rule of law.
Because you live in England. But if you try that in China or Cuba or Soviet Russia, it would have ended badly.
For sure. And if you try that in any of the Gulf states, if you try that in some towns in America, if you, do you know what I mean?
Let's take the corporation one. I mean, the one thing is, if you give it to your boss, you can just go to another business. There are millions of them.
Really?
But if you
rub
the state of the wrong way, then you've got no other options because the state is he's got everything.
And if you want to have a state that is just, there needs to be the rule of law. And in a democracy, I feel like that should be possible if the majority of people are being. Now, I think you need special protections for smaller groups. I think you need I think you need checks and balances. But let's assume a state is working properly. Don't just go, oh, South Africa, that couldn't work just because we have no respect for the law. Although, I mean, South Africans don't have any respect for the law. I don't. But I think the idea that it's inevitable that you're going to be oppressed by this. I wasn't, just because English people are so nice. Sorry, Louise.
Oh, yes. No, sorry, a Nietzschean question coming up again. I'm sure you're familiar with his genealogy of morals. And this question of the respect for law can be explained according to genealogical principles. And one of the reasons why the rule of law took the particular, or the attitude towards the rule of law was shaped in or developed in the particular way it did, was because there was a great deal of legitimacy attached to the anti-apartheid movement. And I believe that Marxism legitimizes revolutionary behavior or breaking the law in the name of a future equality. But what it amounts to is a general lightweight attitude towards the rule of law. So I believe Marxism did play a certain role in shaping the contemporary attitude towards the rule of law in South Africa.
I mean, that's an interesting point. I would say that my experience of a total lack of respect for law, and I don't want this to be a major kind of point because it was a flippant remark, but my experience of the total lack of respect for the law was firmly in the middle class in the 80s and 90s, which was overwhelmingly white and not Marxist. Everybody going like, this one's a bit of an under-the-counter deal because, you know, when to keep it from the tax man. Everybody driving drunk. I'm not saying everybody, but like the vast majority of people. Like just rules are, there's a different, like I'm watching the lockdown here in Britain, and I would be really interested in reading the if you can point me to an article rather than a book, Louise, I'd love it. Just a genealogy of the idea of the rule of law, because in England I'm really struggling with it at the moment. Of people are outraged at this politician who has broken the lockdown laws, and he's not my party. I want to see him fall, but I worry that the reason why they hate him is because he broke the rules, and that offends them more than any of his policies, which I find problematic, I guess.
Guys, I'm gonna try and stop us there while we're ahead. Jonty, I even got a compliment from Simon Brace. Can you believe that? He says this. Thanks for the response, Jonty. It is great hearing your views. You are far more interesting and helpful than
yes,
was.
Guys, you've been so nice. I was really expecting to have the crap kicked out of me tonight. So thank you for being so nice and kind. I appreciate it.
I'm disappointed, Jonty. But in any case, we're going to have you on again. You are unfortunately way too articulate for your own good. And but thank you for presenting the view, and thank you for trying to be honest and I appreciate it, and I think usually it can be a bit of an ideological back and forth, and nobody gets anywhere. But thanks for pushing back. And again, I think these conversations are very, very important, and especially as Christians, we need to figure out a way that we can really make our light shine and fit into that prophetic heritage, as you said, of the Amoses and of Jesus of Nazareth. And I obviously have my reservations, but I think we can definitely agree on that.
Can I say one thing before we finish? Because I worry that you're wrapping up in a hectic way. Well, two things. So when you said go for it, I just chunked in two. The first one is, like so many of your questions and critiques, guys, I think are really valid. I think it's just, how could you make something like this work? And can we get the rest of the church to realize that the good parts of this and try to find ways to make it work well? Would be my kind of like, not challenge to you, but just request is like, you're really smart people. Everyone in your circle listens to you. If you can change people's minds, particularly the Christians, like there's a lot that we could achieve with this kind of thing. And the other one was, I'd love to be able to pray for you guys at the end of the thing, or at some point during a thing. If that'd be okay before we finish.
Unfortunately, that's not allowed, Jonty.
Okay, sorry.
We don't take Marxist prayers. And when you finish that prayer, it's in the name of Jesus, not in the name of Carl.
Jesus Marx? Is that?
No, you got the wrong one. Jonty, it was a hell of a lot of fun. Let's do it again, shall we?
Oh, I would love to, guys. This was so fun.
And let me just say one more thing. Be a Christianity. I mean, it's annoying. Yeah, you're politically correct. You push buttons, but it's fun. It's a lot of fun to listen to.
Great.
So even if you don't like him, go and listen. Beer, Christianity, faith, hops, and love. Go check it out. Jonty, pray for us.
beerchristianity.libsyn.com. Just going to chuck that in there. Okay. All right. Yeah, let's pray. Lord Jesus Christ, thank you so much for the privilege and the freedom of being able to discuss ideas. Thank you for all the blessings that you've given us. God, please make us aware of which blessings come from you and which blessings come from injustice. God, I pray that you would make us uncomfortable, not just with ourselves, but with the way the world works. And God, I pray that you would guide us in what you would have us do and what you would have us think and what you'd have us say. Lord Jesus Christ, please keep us from just being hearers and not doers. But God, please use the people here and their minds and their influence in the lives of people around them. Lord God, I pray that you would throw away anything that I said that was displeasing to you, that they'd forget it, God. And I pray that anything that you wanted them to hear, that they would hear, even if it wasn't actually what I said. I pray, God, that you would bless these people, but more than that, I pray that you would make them a blessing to the people around them and the blessing to your world, Lord. And I ask us in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Cheers, everyone. Next week,
thanks so much. That was so fun.
Next week, we're talking to a capitalist. So it's going to be obviously much better than
All right, guys.
Thanks, Jonty.
Thanks so much, man. That was awesome.